Some of you may have joined us last week for the conversation with Reverend Barber, which was extraordinary and brought solace. Today, I think everyone on this call knows that the pandemic is stress testing our health system, our economy. It's also stress testing our democracy. The incompetent, aspirational authoritarian in the White House, a GOP which insists by its failure to support vote by mail and other urgent electoral reforms that those who fought for the right to vote risk death to vote. Think of Wisconsin. Today we have, perhaps I think, the wisest person in the United States I want to hear from to help us think through how to rebuild a popular people's democracy in these times, how to defend the Constitution in these times. I consider Representative Jamie Raskin from Maryland, Tom Paine 2.0. A fellow free thinker, Jamie is a longtime and fierce advocate and activist for popular democracy. Before his 2016 election to the House, Jamie was an important three-term state senator in Maryland, fighting for marriage equality, civil rights, civil liberties, abolition of the death penalty, a Green New Deal. Spent a quarter century at American universities, Washington College of Law, where he taught about famous national, he taught impeachment cases and earned recognition for his defense of the Constitution systems of checks and balances. I second the view, someone you may know, Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe, who says Raskin is the best constitutional lawyer in all of Congress. His clarity and dedication to truth will ultimately make the difference that the rule of law and the survival of constitutional democracy demand. Jamie emerged as a key player in the House Judiciary Committee during the Trump impeachment, in the same way that a previous generation of new members like Elizabeth Holtzman and Barbara Jordan stepped up during Watergate. He's long thought deeply about structural reforms, democracy reforms, a constitutional right to vote, a national popular vote to upend the Electoral College's grip, fair elections, overturning the travesty of a Supreme Court decision in Citizens United. All bold reforms we need to make this a true democracy. And I would say many of these ideas laid out in Articles for the Nation stretching back 3 decades. I must end with a word about Jamie's father, Marcus Raskin, whose birthday it would have been tomorrow. Mark was in the Kennedy administration. He worked for McGeorge Bundy. He was appalled by the madness of the nuclear arms race. He was a questioner of the entrenched assumptions of Cold War foreign policy consensus. He left to co-found the first truly independent, DC independent think tank, Institute for Policy Studies. Many of you may have heard of it. And he had the, quote, extraordinary conceit of speaking truth to power. Mark became a fierce foe of the Vietnam War, worked with Daniel Ellsberg to get the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, and emerged, as Jamie has, as one of the great radical thinkers of the late 20th, early 21st centuries. He was also a member of the Nation's editorial board for more than 4 decades before his death in December 2017. Jamie, like his father, wants Americans to be inspired to believe again in the power of the people to make their government act. And he understands that you do that acting boldly. As he has said, my ambition is not to be in the political center. My ambition is to be in the moral center. We will get the political center to move to us. Jamie's serious about this. You'll hear more. I just want to introduce our very special guest today who will be in conversation with Jamie briefly after Jamie speaks. John Nichols. If I left it by saying John Nichols is the nation's national affairs correspondent, that would be an act of high crimes and misdemeanors. John knows more about US politics and history than any working journalist I know. A longtime Nation writer, I value his counsel and judgment enormously. The author of too many books to list in an hour call, but he has written about the Trumpocalypse, Dangerous People in America, The Genius of Impeachment, numerous books about how to build a media system worthy of our democracy. And as a 7th generation Wisconsinite, he was the key person covering the occupation of the State House, some of you may remember, which really led to Occupy Wall Street, his book, From Wisconsin Uprising. He's a co-founder of Free Press, and I'm excited about his new book, The Fight for the Soul of the Democratic Party, Henry Wallace, the enduring legacy of Henry Wallace's anti-fascist, anti-racist politics. It is a book for our times, what progressives must do to retake our democracy. Of John, the author and longtime contributing editor of The Nation, Gore Vidal, once said of John, of all the giant slayers now afoot in the great American desert, John Nichols' sword is the sharpest. So I'm going to end here. I simply want to say that Jamie's son, Tommy, has also contributed to the nation. We got a 3-generation Raskin grip on the nation. And welcome you all at this meeting. Join us next week for Bill McKibben. We'll have Naomi Klein early June, Zephyr Teachout, Ai-jen Poo, Elise Hogue of NARAL, but to the inimitable and wonderful Jamie Raskin.
Katrina, thank you so much for those beautiful, lovely words. Thank you especially for invoking my father. My dad used to say, when everything looks hopeless, you're the hope. And so I'm with my nation family today, and I'm feeling the hope. And I'm feeling the commitment and the passion that you guys are bringing to the task of defending democracy and defending our country at a moment when Donald Trump and his administration have brought us to our knees. So thank you for inviting me to be on with you today. Thanks to John Nichols and to your editor, Dan Gutenplan. Thanks to all of you for putting this together. It's a high honor to join you. So I thought I would just talk for a moment of the many things we could talk about the question of reopening America that is very much on everybody's minds. And the president advanced a week ago, Thursday, his so-called plan to reopen America. His plan, of course, was no plan at all. There's nothing in his plan that mentions the federal government. It doesn't talk about what the federal role is, nothing about the federal government mobilizing the industrial apparatus of the country to manufacture the PPEs that our doctors and nurses and first responders and medical personnel need. Nothing in there about mobilizing the scientific community to settle on what are the best tests to advance the search for treatments for a vaccine, and nothing about the federal role in actually coordinating a federal state response that would work to actually get us towards a reopening of commerce, education, social life. What was the federal government's plan? Well, the Trump's plan was a set of flabby guidelines for the states to take into account as they make their own decisions about whether or not to reopen. The guidelines were pretty much useless. They didn't add anything to the store of knowledge that already existed. And what we've seen unfold over the last several days is absolute chaos as this scattershot, helter-skelter reopening, I don't even know that I would call it a regime, reopening era or reopening push by the president unfolds in predictably disastrous ways. And what we're going to see is recurring outbreaks and shutdowns because the plan is no plan at all. Well, then we've got something somewhat more promising, which is what's taking place in certain of the states or certain groups of states that are getting together. There's one in the Northeast that Governor Cuomo has organized. There's one in the Midwest that is emerging. There's one on the West Coast, I think, that's unfolding. Most states still don't belong to these informal groupings or compacts that are beginning to get together. But I think they've got the right idea, which is the states should not be in this brutal competition that the federal government has pitted them against each other in. Up until this point, the states have been competing, the counties have been competing, the cities have been competing for masks, for gloves, for gowns, for medical equipment, for the ventilators that we need to save our people. That takes us back basically to the Articles of Confederation after the American Revolution, but before we had a constitution where we didn't really have an effective central government, and the states all had their own trade policies. They were in trade wars with each other. They were competing for equipment and material. There were border stops of citizens coming from other states, the kind of hostility that we've seen growing in certain parts of the country. But in any event, the states at least have an idea that we need something formalized. And then what we're getting, I hope, in Congress is the formulation of a plan. Now, last Friday, I introduced the Reopen America Act with my co-sponsors, Hakeem Jeffries from New York, whose district has been very badly hit, Donna Shalala, who was the HHS secretary in the Clinton administration, Peter Welch from Vermont, Anna Eshoo. What's in our plan? Our plan says that the federal government should not be stealing equipment from the states, which it's been doing. It's been intervening and seizing shipment of material that they need. The federal government should be coordinating the production of all of the PPEs and the health equipment that we need to get through the crisis. And so it calls for, it provides for the creation of a health equipment production board based on the war production board of World War II and other periods of military mobilization. It also convenes a scientific advisory committee to make sure that we're getting the best possible scientific advice. But then what it says is that reopening will be a product of federal-state collaboration. We will invite all of the states to present reopening plans to the federal government. Those plans will be acceptable when two scientific conditions have been met in the states. One, the hospitals are able to meet the demand so that they're not overwhelmed. And two, and this is the critical one, the slope of the curve of transmission is downwards rather than upwards. And what does that mean? The transmission rate is below 1, so that the average person who gets the disease is transmitting it to no more than one other person, hopefully nobody, but 0.4, 0.8, 0.6, any of those will work. That puts us on the downward slope. If it's above 1, if it's 1.4, if it's 1.8, if it's 2 or 2.1, we get what we've got now, which is pandemic conditions. America's now gone over 1 million documented cases. It's probably much higher than that. And our casualty rate in 3 months is larger than the number of people that we lost in more than a decade in the Vietnam War, if you can believe that. So that's what happens when the rate is out of control. It's been brought down in a lot of places through the power of social distancing, but obviously we don't have a vaccine and we don't have an effective treatment for it, and we're losing lots and lots of our people. But when the states have met those conditions, they're ready to apply, and they can put in there exactly what their regime of testing will be, what their regime of contact tracing will be, and what public health protocols they will institute to make sure that we've got maintained social distancing. And then what are the rules that operate in different social domains, K through 12, colleges, universities, the workplace, different forms of social spaces, auditoriums, stadiums, and so on. The role of the federal government will be to advise them, to coach them, to help improve those plans, and then improve them, and then we will pay for it. The federal government will fund the reopening in the various states. And you can see how this is a real systematic, methodical, and scientifically based approach, as opposed to the madness that we've got going on right now, which will plunge us immediately back into cycles of reinfection, outbreak, and then shutdown. So just like during the impeachment, the question is, can the separation of powers work? Can the original constitutional design function? Well, it worked in the House and it didn't work in the Senate because of the derangement of the Republican Party. This crisis tests whether we can make American federalism work. Can we have a coordinated response between the central government, the national government, and the states that gets us all through the crisis? And that's being tested under the worst possible conditions, with the president whose conduct and behavior are increasingly deranged and out of touch with reality. So that's the test for us now. And I'm very happy to yield back to you, Katrina, and then to take whatever questions or ideas people want to float.
Jamie, thank you for reminding us of the test we face. I want to bring in John Nichols, who I introduced earlier, so that you could have a brief conversation with John before throwing it open to the many participants on this call. Thank you, Jamie.
Yes, I'm glad to enter in, and thanks for having me, everyone. Hi to everybody out there. We've got the better part of 200 people with us now, and it's very exciting to have all of your questions coming up. I'm seeing them here, and I'll integrate some of them even into the initial questions that I ask, and then we'll go more directly. So as we're talking, don't hesitate to put some questions into the Q&A section there. So Jamie Raskin, you alluded to this at the end of your comments, but I want to take you deep in for a moment here to the question of how the House of Representatives responds to the moment that we are in. And you have a view of the House of Representatives that it is in fact not merely a co-equal branch, that Congress is not merely co-equal, but in fact that it has higher responsibilities. Could you give us just a moment on that, and then I'll give you a couple questions coming off it.
Well, if you read the Constitution, you'll understand that that's got to be the case. The preamble of the Constitution: we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare, do hereby ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States, is followed immediately by all legislative power is vested in the Congress of the United States. And then you get, John, as you know, this detailed elucidation of all of the powers of Congress to regulate commerce among the states and with foreign nations, the power to establish a post office, which we need to be zealously enforcing and defending at this moment, the power to regulate the capital city, intellectual property, naturalization, and immigration, on and on and on. All of that is within the legislative power. It's the lawmaking power of the people that is passed to Congress. And then you get to Article 2, and what is the president's main job? Well, the president's main job is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, to be commander-in-chief, not of the nation, not even of the government, commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy in times of actual war and insurrection, and of the state militias when they're called up. But basically, the president's job is to enforce the laws that have been adopted by the Congress. And, all of Section 4 in Article 2 is all about how you impeach a president. So, I like to point out that Congress has the power to impeach the president. He doesn't have the power to impeach us, which I think tells you everything that you need to know about the proper relationship between Congress and the president. So, this whole period has been an effort to get us to reassert that basic relationship and the essential powers of Congress.
So that's what makes this period pretty frustrating, because Congress, by and large, isn't in Washington, and we have not had a major move toward a remote voting, proxy voting, virtual hearings, things of that nature. And so Bob Borisage, who's on the call and one of our wiser thinkers, he really asks, or suggests, and I'll quote from Bob if I can read well here. This is a shocking failure. The House can't drive the agenda if it doesn't find a way to be back in session. So talk to us about that for a moment. Tell us, A, your view on this, and B, kind of a status update, because I know there is some movement toward a possible proxy voting system.
Yes. Well, thank you. I appreciate that, John, and I appreciate that, Bob. And I agree totally. I mean, I have, look, it's easy for me to say, and it's been a little bit awkward because I live closer to the U.S. Capitol than any other member of the House, except for Eleanor Holmes Norton, who doesn't have a vote yet as the representative, the non-voting representative for D.C. So, it's easy for me to say, let's all be back here. But I've also said, let's be back here. If we can't be back here in person, let's have distance voting either by proxy, and I'm happy as one of the local members to take people's proxy in. That's a proxy without any discretion or any judgment on my part. I'm like a letter carrier, just bringing the vote in. Or let's do it by Zoom, and let's do it by technology. When it was first suggested that we do that, there was a lot of outrage. People were saying, we'll be hacked, it'll be vulnerable to foreign sabotage and all this kind of stuff. But look, when you're on Zoom and when you're using technology or TV, we can put it on C-SPAN, everybody sees exactly what's going on. So if somebody tries to alter my vote or to change my voice or whatever, everybody will see it, and I'll start shouting from the rooftops, that's not how I meant to vote. So I don't think that's a serious objection. When we really get people to think through it, we can use the technology to make this happen, and we've got to use it, because otherwise the natural advantage that the executive branch has, which is it's one guy, no matter how deranged or incompetent he might be, it is one guy as opposed to 535 people, all speaking in different ways. But the technology can bring us back together to make sure that we've got a voice, that we're having hearings, and we've got a vote, and that our votes are recorded and publicly known. We can make this happen. We've got to do it.
And based off another question, which I think is an important one here, that's also a way that you can leverage the Senate, because if the House has a vote on an issue, if you move through a package and vote for it, doesn't that create pressure on the Senate to act, especially if it's something that's very popular, like, I don't know, vote by mail?
Yes, indeed. Vote by mail is a great example, but any of these spending packages should be originating in the House when you think about it, because they're money bills. So they should be starting from the House. And we should not be maneuvered into accepting just totally outrageous ripoffs that the Senate Republicans continue to tuck into the legislation, like all of these tax loopholes and tax breaks that have been written in for the top 1% or 1/10 of the 1% of the people, and that are loaded onto unemployment insurance and the small business relief we did in the PPP under these terrible conditions where nobody can legislate. So all we can do is basically ratify what's been taking place. I think there is growing strong sentiment within the House that we cannot be maneuvered in that way under these desperation conditions. Again, we've got to be here to fight for exactly the legislation we want. Now, having said that, the Republicans control the Senate. The Republicans control the White House. We know the Republicans essentially control the Supreme Court. So even before COVID-19, we're not bringing the strongest hand to the table because all we've got is the House, but we at least can be using all of the power we've got in the House to fight for the things that we believe in.
So let me ask you about another power as well, which is the power of oversight. And you sit on the Rules Committee, and you participated last week in what will probably go down in the history of Congress as one of the 2 or 3 most bizarre debates ever held. And it involved you sitting there wearing your mask, doing everything that the American people are asked to do, arguing with Jim Jordan about oversight. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Well, the Rules Committee had convened. Originally, we thought we were going to be voting on this legislation to establish the ability of distance voting by proxy. That ended up getting pushed to the side because the Republicans said, let's make it bipartisan, and a group was formed to discuss that. So then we were, the Rules Committee had convened to talk about the promotion of the bill to create the new committee on COVID-19 to oversee everything related to COVID-19, all of the spending of the money, both through the big Treasury Department slush fund that was created, as well as unemployment insurance and the hospital money, as well as overseeing reopening and testing and so on. The Capitol physician, Dr. Monahan, had issued a recommendation saying that all members should be wearing a mask when we come in. And the protocol that basically was evolving was you wear your mask when you're in public places. When you speak, you can remove the mask so you can be heard directly. And then you put it right back on. And while you're speaking, obviously people can be at a 10 feet distance. They can get away from you. They see that you're speaking. Well, Jim Jordan waltzed into the Rules Committee not wearing a mask. And we had, at that point, every Democratic and Republican member wearing a mask. So I raised a point of order with Chairman Jim McGovern saying, are we not following a rule that members should be masked? And he explained what the doctor had said, and Jordan said, I'm not violating any rule of the House, which is true. It's not in the formal rule of the House, but it was issued by the doctor as a recommendation, and it's rude as hell and it's dangerous. Look, Jim Jordan doesn't wear a jacket. If he doesn't want to wear a jacket, I don't care about that. That's a fashion statement. But if he doesn't want to wear a mask, that's not a fashion statement. That's a public health threat to everybody else. He's making a decision for everyone else. So I just said to him, as much as I could through my mask, Mr. Jordan, it's not a statement of your bravery that you won't wear a mask. It's a statement of your irresponsibility. And I, invoked all of the nurses and doctors. If you want to prove how tough and brave you are, go volunteer at the hospital for a day. That's where people are really demonstrating courage. But if you decide you're not going to wear a mask and you're not going to follow other public health protocols in public, you're just proving what a jerk you are. That's basically my feeling about it.
He didn't take it very well, though. There was really a back and forth there that was pretty intense, worthy of watching. I think you came out better in the discussion. But one of the interesting things was, at the core of that, you were arguing about oversight. And this is one of the most frustrating things about Congress not being fully up to speed as regards virtual meetings, virtual hearings and that, because there's a need for real-time oversight, isn't there? Both on the president's handling of this, which I would argue has been contemptible, and also on just all this money that is flowing, but without sufficient oversight.
Yeah, look, the Trump administration was set up from day one as a money-making operation. I mean, he's turned the presidency into an instrument of self-enrichment, and by extension, class enrichment. We saw that with the $1.5 trillion tax cut for the wealthiest people in the country that they did back in 2017. They don't want any oversight over anything. I mean, that was, one of the two counts in the impeachment against him. The president was obstructing Congress in our ability to get the information that we needed about his high crimes and misdemeanors. And there's oral argument taking place this week in the DC circuit about this very point, whether we can even challenge the president's refusal to be bound by the law. For example, we appropriate money for particular purposes. He reallocates the money for the wall and then doesn't listen to us. Then we want to go to court to try to enforce what the law is. And then they say, we don't have any authority to go to court. There's no standing, or it's a political question, or the courts can't hear it. I mean, they are trying to construct a house of legal cards that creates a monarchy in the country. So it is all about the oversight. They would obviously love to spend hundreds of billions of dollars for the airline industry and the cruise industry and the hotel industry without any oversight about where the money's going. It's unacceptable. I mean, that can't be right. That's an absolute defeat of the constitutional design and the power of the people that's been vested in Congress. Madison had this beautiful statement where he said that knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and those who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge gives. And in a democracy, knowledge is everything. We've got to know where every penny and every dollar is going that we've allocated for very specific public purposes.
We've got a questioner on our Q&A who comes right off something that you said, urging Congress to repeal or amend the tax cuts. And what he asks is that in this emergency moment, is that something that could be raised, and would it stand a chance?
It could be raised. It would definitely pass, or I would say it would probably pass in the House with overwhelming Democratic support. The problem, of course, is that Donald Trump considers this his signal success, his big triumph. And look, remember the basic scenario here. We have hundreds of bills that are sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk. The background check on violent criminals for gun purchases sitting on his desk, the $15 minimum wage hike sitting on his desk, gerrymandering reform, everything that's in HR 1, campaign finance reform, all of it sitting on McConnell's desk. It's not moving. So it's not as if McConnell wants the Senate to be doing anything other than confirming a bunch of midnight right-wing judges from the Federalist Society who will be there to cement the legislative victories that they've had and then try to knock down anything that they consider antithetical to GOP orthodoxy.
So a great question coming from Jennifer in Alabama. And it relates to what you've been talking about. It'll lead us into a couple more questions from other folks here. But she asked something that I think goes to your heart. She says, do you think part of the problem is that in all of this is that sometime along the way, we stopped teaching civics in a way that helped people to actually understand that system of checks and balances and the role of Congress, and that it has sort of infected all of our politics now. So we've kind of got into this imperial president mode where it's all around the presidency and very little around the role of Congress.
Oh, well, I agree completely with that. John, that I wrote a book for high school kids called We the Students, which is about all the Supreme Court decisions that affect kids in public high schools, locker searches, drug testing, the segregation and desegregation cases, Title IX, and so on, with the idea that we've got to begin to engage young people while they're in school about how you become a citizen. And instead, what we've seen in large parts of the country is an absolute demolition of civic education and critical thinking skills generally. And obviously, the Republican Party now, which is operating like a deranged death cult, is set up on the principle that you don't teach people science, you don't teach people to use reason, and you don't teach people critical thinking skills. And when I turn on Fox News, the amazing thing is how replete with fallacy and dogma and lies everything is, and people just ingest that. It's a really scary thing for a democracy, and it runs totally antithetical to what the founders were all about. And the founders were deeply flawed in their own ways, and of course, centrally made a compromise with the original sin of the country, which was slavery and the dispossession of the Native Americans. But these were at least people who advanced ideas about reason and about science and about logic, and not being governed by religious dogma. And what's amazing about the GOP is it's now governed by religious and theocratic dogma, although it's led by people who have nothing close to what anybody would recognize as a real religious faith, a real religious belief. It's just used for the purposes of thought control. It's like a religious cult where the people at the top no longer believe in the dogma, but they get everybody at the bottom to believe in it. And I've said to some of my Republican colleagues, you guys may as well be selling incense out at Dulles International Airport, given the way that they've suspended critical thought, and they will go along with anything that Donald Trump tells them.
Well, speaking of suspension of critical thought, there's also, you mentioned Donald Trump, but there's also money in politics, and there is the influence of corporate power. And Nancy Jacobson asks, or suggests that she's very concerned about reports that the Republicans in the Senate will, on behalf of its corporate donors, or on behalf of their corporate donors, seek to add a provision to the next stimulus bill or whatever comes out, relieving corporate employers of liability on COVID-19 issues. And I've been seeing a lot of discussion of this lately, sometimes put in the frame of, oh, well, this will be just a part of what we have to do to get going. But isn't that as a law professor, a lawyer, this is a really critical thing, isn't it? These liabilities.
Oh, hey, Mitch McConnell brought it up yesterday. I mean, but both he and Trump seem to be putting out what their bargain is going to be. We obviously want hundreds of billions of dollars to rescue the states and local governments, and we would like to see a real national reopening plan so we can get out of this nightmare that Trump has plunged us into. Trump seems to want to attack sanctuary cities. That's what he's talking about. But McConnell, with his eye always on the demands of the largest corporations, he wants tort reform. He wants to destroy the liability of the legal liability of big companies and so on. I've just drafted a letter about this, specifically related to big gas and big coal and big oil. The carbon industry would love to use this as an opportunity to sneak in absolution for anything they've ever done, so they can't be sued for the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in damages they've inflicted on our society and our economy. So the answer is yes. The corporate powers want to use this as an opportunity to get out of jail free card for everything that they've ever done, and we obviously have to fight that with everything that we've got. That in itself is a massive transfer of wealth and power upwards.
It's a very frustrating thing because you say you have to fight that, but it's also this question of bargaining power between the House and Senate. So at one time you have to fight horrible ideas that will do tremendous harm, while at the same time trying to bargain for good ideas that are needed. And when you strike that balance, is it going to be possible, and on something, and I'll let you talk about this more broadly, on something that's a real passion of yours, and that is vote by mail. Is it going to be possible in this next bargain to do the two things that are necessary, I would argue, for defending democracy, and that is save the Postal Service and get resources out to the states, at least as an option, to go to a universal vote by mail or some sort of broad vote by mail system in the fall.
John, thanks for raising both of them, and they're linked, obviously, because you don't have vote by mail if you don't have a post office, and the GOP's been doing everything in their power to dismantle or privatize the post office and to put it into a straitjacket. But look, we fought for $4 billion in the original CARES Act to be distributed through the Election Assistance Commission to the states for the purposes of building a strong vote by mail option in all of the states, and also to fortify direct voting to make sure that where there is voting in person and it's still taking place, that people can do it safely. So the Republicans opposed all of it, and we ended up with $400 million, which was 1/10 of what we asked for, but it was something, and we were able to put some money in the pipeline. We're going to come back again to ask for all of the money that we really need to make this happen. It is an emergency, and it should be a bipartisan or nonpartisan or transpartisan commitment that we have a real election where everybody's voting rights are protected and everybody can participate and get their vote counted. So President Trump has voted by mail in New York and in Florida. We've got a number of states, including Oregon, including Utah, that have moved to primarily vote by mail systems, and the voter turnout rate is much higher than the average all over the country. I think in Oregon, it's over 70% of the people are voting by mail. We can make this work. But for Trump, it's just one more reason for him to hate the post office. He has a whole conspiracy theory about Jeff Bezos and how the post office is carrying some Amazon packages for them at too cheap a rate and so on. And, everything for him comes back to his own self-interest and his own pet hatreds. But there are enough Republican legislatures, secretaries of state, and governors who've bought into vote by mail, who are willing to be honest about it, that I think we can form a bipartisan consensus in Congress that we've got to advance vote by mail. And that's going to be the way to save this election from the nightmare scenario that we saw in your beloved state, John. That was just sickening to see what the Republican Supreme Court did, overriding the governor's executive order, compelling an election to go forward in a way where I think dozens of precinct polling places were not open because they couldn't get anybody to go out and work them. And then we saw in Milwaukee, I think it was 4 or 5, you'll correct me, places that were open for the entire city, and those huge lines wrapped around the block for 3 or 4 hours of people lining up to go vote. Those citizens are my heroes, and what they did was amazing in that election, but we should never subject American citizens to that test of, do you love voting and democracy enough that you're willing to put your own health and your family's health and your neighbor's health at risk like that? And I think that they found 17 or 20 people came down with COVID-19 from presumably that day.
Brother, it's up to 52 as of this morning. 52 voters and poll workers, according to the State Department of Health, who have tested positive and were at least in polling places that day. They're tracking it. So the fact of the matter is these numbers are real. And the one concern that I'll follow up, and we have a couple questioners in this area, is on getting to vote by mail. There's a timeline on that. Congress has got to move pretty quickly to get resources out to the states to make this big change. And Brennan Center says you're looking at about $2 billion is needed. So it's a drop in the bucket compared to the trillions, but there's not a lot of time, is there?
Well, we thought we were coming back May 4. It looks like we're coming back May 11th now, a week from Monday. But for the people who are fired up about this, and most of the Democrats are, and I'm the vice chair of the House Committee on Administration, which oversees elections, we're all fired up about it there. We understand that this is the critical moment. This is it. And it's a life and death issue, as you say. It is a democracy or death issue. And so, we got to fight for our democracy as if our lives depend on it, which they do. This is the moment that we're in, and everything is converging on this last big package, which is, you could either call it the COVID 4.0 or the CARES Act 2.0. I think Speaker Pelosi started to call it the HEROES Act, because most of the money is going to be going to the states and the counties for the cops and the firefighters and the nurses and the frontline responders. But there's a lot of other stuff that we want to happen in here, including about reopening and about the democracy. And as you say, nothing is more central to our future than the democracy provisions, the election provisions of this, because without that, they'll steal everything from us. And, at this point in the Trump administration, I think everybody understands you cannot put anything past them, anything.
When you say you can't put anything past them, what do you mean?
Well,
relating to democracy.
I can imagine them staging a whole series of provocations and, confusing moments like they did in Bush versus Gore at Florida. Remember the Gucci riot, where they had a bunch of paid GOP operatives claiming that their voting rights were being violated, and then using those incidents as a pretext for Republican-controlled state legislatures simply reclaiming their Article 2 powers and saying, we're going to appoint the electors for Trump because it's too foggy here in Wisconsin or North Carolina or Ohio to know who really won. So we're just going to have a party line vote and appoint the electors and give them to Trump. I mean, there was basically an invitation from the right wing of the Supreme Court to do that in Bush versus Gore, where they wrote, as you know, of course, there is no individual constitutional right of any citizen to vote. The power belongs to the states under the Electoral College, which raises the larger problem of why we've got to fight to get out of the Electoral College system the way it's understood now and get to a national popular vote for president. But in the meantime, we've got to fight for a fair count of what the popular vote is in every state and not allow them to get away with any mischief.
Makes this a very central issue. Let's go on to some economics here, because we've got a lot of questions in that area. One of our callers, or one of our chatters, says that with something like 8 to 10 million young Americans graduating from high school and college this spring into a wildly uncertain future and depression-level unemployment, is anyone in Congress considering a proposal for a national service corps? Some sort of working on environmental issues, climate issues, infrastructure. I mean, this is going back to straight into FDR, New Deal type response, but we're talking about a Great Depression potentially that might require it.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And a letter went out, I think we had 40 or 50 signers calling for a revival of national service. I mean, look, if we're going to do what South Korea and the other countries that have successfully combated COVID-19 have done, we're going to need an army of contact tracers. And what does that mean? If somebody comes down with the disease, a contact tracer will immediately interview them on the phone and say, tell me every place you've been in the last 2 weeks. Give me the names and the emails and the phone numbers of everybody you've been in contact with, and I'm going to call them up. We've got to put the virus on the run. We've got to go on the hunt, but that's going to take hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. And we happen to have millions of unemployed people and millions of talented unemployed people, and all of these wonderful young people have just gotten out of high school and college who are looking at a bleak future if we don't take seriously mobilizing them as a force in what the president called a war or wartime conditions against the virus. So there's a lot to do. There were, I think, around 3 million applications for people to become census workers, census takers, and they hired somewhere around 500,000, maybe 600,000 of them. But that's 2.5 million people who are saying, I want to do work of counting Americans. I think most of them would probably be interested if we got back in touch with them and said, well, we were not able to hire everybody for the census, but how would you like to be a contact tracer and help to get involved in this public health effort? So I think that we need to take very seriously the whole concept of national service and using government resources to put people to work through the crisis.
So President Trump's been talking about the Defense Production Act and some of these different measures. You've referenced them somewhat. It seems that the president at this point is abusing some of that power, like telling meatpacking plants to stay open when they are unsafe and things like that. But
Right.
one of the people contacting us, Craig, says, it basically says, how should we think about it? It's obviously such a critical tool. Are there ways that Congress should be defining its use?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, Donald Trump has two basic modes. Either one, he's like a moviegoer, he's a TV watcher. He's just watching it on TV and he's commenting on this person or that person, and he'll heckle somebody and say, you've gone too far, or open your stores or open your businesses, which is just, when you think about it in formal governmental terms, it's just meaningless. Or he's King Kong and he's claiming, I've got all the power and I'm going to boss everybody around. I'm going to tell the states exactly what to do, which is also ludicrous, and the Supreme Court rejected in the Steele seizure case when President Truman, with far more justification than Trump, tried to take over the steel plants in order to continue war production during the Korean War. But the Supreme Court said you can't do that. That's up to Congress to decide, and Congress is not giving you the power to do that. Congress is also not given Trump the power to start bossing states around in reopening commerce or whatever. Even the state governors can't order a business to open. That's up to the business. That's up to the business owner whether or not they're going to open or not. So all of it is based on a whole bunch of constitutional fallacies. Look, what we really need is to get back to basics. We're in a crisis and we are one nation, and we got to learn to bring the federal government together with the states. And the way we usually do it, and we should be doing it, is through the spending power. And we can say there's a right way to reopen and a wrong way to reopen. And we're going to follow science, and we're going to follow the public health experts, and we're going to help the states come up with regional compacts, and we're going to give them the best advice, and then we're going to pay for it. That's what the federal government should be doing, instead of what Trump does, which is either watching TV and throwing popcorn at people, or saying, I'm the boss, I'm King Kong, I'm going to step on everybody. And then the next day he goes back to being an innocent bystander.
So you talk about Congress seizing back some of this power. We have several questions, a variety of different ones from John, from Mary, and some other folks on the chat, about the incredible power that the Federal Reserve is exercising right now, and the lack of congressional kind of oversight of that. And, just literally going to even issues of issuing money and things of this nature. So are there ways that Congress can claw back a little bit of influence and authority there? Because it does seem like we have sort of these two separate tracks, right? The Fed shoring up Wall Street, and we see, like stocks going up and stuff like that. And then Congress over here talking about unemployment and all these other issues.
But absolutely. The lawmaking power belongs to Congress, and it cannot delegate away its lawmaking power. There's something called the non-delegation doctrine. Congress can't say, well, there's a problem out there, but we don't know how to deal with it, so we're going to delegate it to somebody else and let them pass the laws. No, all of the lawmaking power belongs with the House and the Senate. They've got to come together bicamerally, pass legislation, and it goes to the president. So I think that the Fed could be really pushing the limits of the non-delegation doctrine if it is just making up its own rules as it goes. And so I think that we need to tighten the reins, and we need to make sure that all of the money is subject to congressional oversight, that all of the money is subject to congressional rules. We set up an oversight panel in the original CARES Act and an inspector general in the Treasury Department. President Trump, in his signing statement, rejected the constitutionality of what we've done. So we've got to fight for that. But we also put on some very specific strings on the money coming out of there. For example, the money cannot be used for stock buybacks. The money cannot be used for CEO and other executive bonuses. The money cannot go to the president's family's own businesses or any member of Congress's businesses. For that matter. Those are congressional strictures that need to apply to all of the money that's being spent out there. And we're going to have to use every oversight apparatus we've got, the oversight committee, the new committee that has been set up under Jim Clyburn to oversee just COVID-19 related questions, as well as the bicameral bipartisan committee, which there's still no chair of, and it looks like maybe the Republicans are blockading the appointment of a chair so it can't do any oversight. Amazingly, when Jim Jordan and I had our back and forth about the mask and everything, it was about oversight. And he was saying, no, we don't need any more oversight. He said there are 8 committees that could do oversight on COVID-19. We don't need a 9th. I asked him if he remembered how many committees did investigations into Benghazi. And of course, he didn't remember. There were 10, and his was the 10th one. And they spent millions and millions of dollars to find that there was no wrongdoing by Hillary Clinton there. And yet he went on a long diatribe defending what they'd done in Benghazi. Gee, what's more important, to have another Benghazi investigation to find that there had been no government misconduct, or to follow the trillions of dollars that we're having to spend to clean up after the chaos created by Donald Trump?
We're getting toward our closing moments here, but we got just a couple quick things I want to bring in. Jamie, you sound like a very honorable and thoughtful congressman here, a law professor and all that, but really you're a political junkie who is fascinated by elections and politics. And so Michael from Suffolk County out in Long Island asks, it says, put your pundit hat on here. This is a incredibly turbulent moment in that. What do you think the political playout of this will be as regards control of the House, control of the Senate, and a host of other political
Well,
issues?
I think that we are headed for a dramatic political and moral landslide election. Certainly the greatest of our lifetime. So the landslide part, I've got no doubt about. It's the election part that I've got my questions about. Will they allow us to actually have an election? Will there be staged provocations? And will the Republicans be up to all of their old tricks in voter suppression, in throwing people off of the voter rolls, and moving elections around, closing polling places, all those kinds of things. So, Hillary beat Trump by 3.5 million votes back then, before Trump brought the country to its knees in every sense, economically, politically, in the eyes of the world. John, there are people abroad who are saying, we've felt a lot of things towards America: love, hate, fear, envy, admiration. We never felt pity before. We are being pitied by people around the world because of the way that Donald Trump has wrecked the processes of government. I think it's going to be perfectly obvious to the American people, to the people who can see it, who can still exercise their Paynean common sense. If we can have a real election where there's a mail-in ballot and people can safely cast their votes, we are going to have a landslide. Now, we need to organize. We need to use all of these new mechanisms from Zoom on down to learn how to organize people. My Democracy Summer project with high school and college kids is up and running, and we're going to be doing it online, and all of you are going to be asked to come and participate. We're going to have the greatest political thinkers and leaders and activists in the country addressing America's high school and college kids, and we're going to open it up. And then during the week, since we're not able to knock on doors and canvass, the Democracy Summer kids are going to be doing phone calls to senior citizens and others, basically conducting what we're going to call a civic checkup, saying to them, does everybody have access to food in your house? Do you need groceries? Do you have all of the prescription drugs and health you need? And then putting them in touch with people, if there's a mental health problem, who you're in touch with. And then we're going to ask them, have you completed your census form? Can you make sure you go do your census? Is there anybody there who needs to register to vote? We're going to explain to you how you get people registered to vote. Do you want to get involved in the campaign? Here's how you get involved in the campaign. So that's the way that we're going to try to use the awkwardness of this moment to mobilize a telephone army of high school and college kids in Democracy Summer to help get the vote out and to make sure our people have understanding about everything they need to be doing in 2020, which still, despite all of the debacles and catastrophes, still I'm calling 2020 the year of perfect vision. We've got to have perfect vision about what has befallen the Republic and what we need to get out of it.
To clarify one thing, I know from our previous conversations, you don't doubt that there will be an election in November. What you're worried about is whether it will be a high turnout election, a real reflection of where the American people are out. All right.
Correct. The government, the president has no power to cancel the election. I know people are afraid of that. I'm sure it's occurred to him, but he has no power to do it. It's going to be up to the states. I'm most concerned about mischief by Republican state legislatures who are still under the spell of Donald Trump, trying to cast their electors in a way that's contrary to the popular vote of the people in the state.
1 minute answer from you here before we wind down. One of the most poetic things that you've done over the last month or so has been to drive in from your home in suburban Washington to the Capitol and sit in the empty House chamber and essentially call it into session, if I'm correct. Is that roughly? Tell us why you do that.
Well, we have to have pro forma sessions because of different constitutional requirements in the agreement between the House and the Senate and so on. And so in these pro forma sessions, bills can be sent back and forth between the House and the Senate. Bills can be introduced. And if Speaker Pelosi's not in town, someone's got to go down there. And as I was saying, I can drive straight down North Capitol Street. These days, it takes me about 15 minutes to get down to the Capitol. So now we don our masks. I put on my mask. I've got a great Maryland mask. I should have it in front of me so I could audition it for you guys. We also, by the way, have political masks that we're getting made, which say, "Let America breathe again, vote Democrat." And that's going to be the official Democracy Summer mask. But I go down and then, I do my part. I mean, I don't have to spend time on airplanes the way my colleagues do. And so I've got greater access to the Capitol. So when they ask me to come down to be the Speaker pro tem, I'm always delighted to do it.
Well, and you do it well. To all of our folks who've joined us today, better part of 200 folks, and to Sarah Burke, Peter Rothberg, Aaron O'Mara, and Katrina vanden Heuvel, who've helped to put this all together, as well as Anna Hyatt and all sorts of other folks. A big thanks. And I want to close off by thanking you, Jamie Raskin, for joining us, and also thanking you for just the seriousness that you've brought to defending the Constitution, even in these very challenging times.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Peter. Thank you to the whole nation family. Hang tough, everybody. Stay safe and stay healthy. And let's make it through this thing.